This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Like the kōkako, the saddleback, or tieke, belongs to the New Zealand wattlebird family. A family to which the huia belonged and which has been established in this country since ancient times, much longer than most of our other birds. The saddleback takes its name from the bright reddish saddle on its back, which according to legend is the mark of Maui's hand. Sadly, this attractive bird has disappeared from the main islands and exists only on a few offshore islands, carefully chosen locations for resettlement away from predators, which appears to have saved the tieke from total extinction.
Community or chaos? We can construct and nurture community or fall into chaos. Over the next hour, Marvin Hubbard hosts conversations toward creating a fairer, more equal society.
Community or Chaos is made possible with the support of Quakers Aotearoa. You'll find them online at quaker.nz.
Good day, friends. Today we're talking with Quintin Findlay, the senior organizer of the National Union of Public Employees and a doctor of philosophy at the University of Lincoln, Canterbury. And he is a former member and founder of both the New Labour Party and the Alliance. You can podcast this by going to oar.org.nz and then going to podcast and going to Community or Chaos. Welcome to Chaos, Quentin.
Thank you, Marvin. It's been a long time between talks with you on this show.
Yes, it has been about.
In fact, I seem to remember the last time I was on your show was probably around about 2000 or 2001, where we talked about the Alliance. So, I mean, I find it quite unusual. I'm actually back after about 20-odd years talking about the Alliance, something I never expected to actually talk about at all.
Well, neither did I, to be honest. Could you tell us about you and your first tell us a bit about the New Labour Party and the Alliance, some of the history.
Okay, well, I can talk about that. The New Labour Party, of course, was formed in 1989, basically as a result and so on of ructions within the Labour Party itself caused by the fourth Labour government and so on at the time. The government had, since 1984, basically embarked on essentially a program of neoliberalism, which was about essentially selling off assets, balancing budgets, lowering wages, doing a lot of the things and so on that we now associate and so on with what the current national government and so on is actually doing, and they started it.
It's a bit
Jim
like
Anderton.
Yep. I can tell you about one successful feature of Labor's sell-off and privatization. That's electric power. Isn't it so much cheaper and more efficient now?
Yes, it is. Yes, it's fantastic. In fact, all the reforms have led to such great efficiency and so on in the economy. I am being sarcastic here. Basically, what happened was with the New Labour Party was that Jim Anderton, who at that point had been a Labour caucus, a member of the Labour caucus, essentially
he was president of the Labour Party for a short time, wasn't he?
He was, yep, he was in the late 70s and early 80s. And he decided at the time he was the MP for Sydenham, and him and a number of others, of which I was part of, decided to leave the Labour Party and form the New Labour Party as basically a response and so on to what the government was doing. The New Labour Party was committed to a democratic socialist program, which basically meant it was committed to Labour's original, probably its sort of social democratic philosophy and policies. So full employment, a managed economy, fully publicly funded education and health systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And state housing. I don't think we have too many people sleeping in the street. I can remember when we didn't have anybody sleeping in the streets, actually.
Yes, well...
That's a long time ago.
It is a long time ago. And in fact, the number of people now sleeping in the streets has increased quite dramatically.
Well, according to some people's outlook, that's an improvement because that means the state's not involved.
Yes, exactly. It's so much better for everyone, isn't it? Again, I'm being sarcastic.
Who would guess?
Yes. Yeah.
Now,
so, yep.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that after several years and so on, the NLP basically, essentially, I wouldn't say combined, but essentially came together with other parties that included the Greens, the Democrats, the Liberals, and Manamotahake to form the Alliance, which was at the time a combination of parties that was headed by Jim and so on too, with co-leaders Jeanette Fitzsimons and Sandra Lee. And essentially the Alliance campaigned and so on for really a social democratic policy and platform, and was probably one of those groups that was instrumental in ensuring that MMP, of course, was basically adopted in 1993 because we campaigned heavily on MMP in that election. We essentially basically got MPs elected to the House, and then in 2001 that all fell apart for various reasons. Jim had become Deputy Prime Minister in a Labour-led government, and then, of course, essentially there was a lot of angst, one could actually say, about the Alliance policies, how we perceived that Labour wasn't really implementing them or pursuing them, and Jim's actions and all came to a head, of course, over Iraq, and that was when essentially the party split. Jim left, and in 2002 we were thrown out of Parliament.
Well, was Dunedin very involved in the New Labour Party and Alliance? Were they involved in, for instance, creating policy or suggesting policy?
I mean, the Dunedin North branch was very involved, and so was Dunedin South. We had a very large branch, if I recall, Dunedin North, over 400 members. We were essentially very active, involved in policy. At the time, we had Jim Flynn, Professor Jim Flynn, who essentially was the candidate who stood several times and really was the force behind the branch, myself and Charles Pigden, and so on, who often did our policy work and so on like that. We have quite a comprehensive slate of policy, and essentially we always, I think, punched above our weight, so to speak. Basically, for example, Dunedin North consistently got about 7 or 8% above what the Alliance was polling when it came to the general elections. So I think we were very involved and very highly coordinated.
Now, why you're now on the national executive of the Resurrected Alliance. Could you talk about why the Alliance Party is being resurrected after being dormant for over a decade?
Well, I'm actually not on the national executive. I basically made a decision not to put my name forward, mainly because I like being retired in one sense from it, and my normal life, as a union organiser, gives me plenty to work and worry about. But, however, it hasn't worked out that way, Marvin. As you can appreciate, they keep on dragging me into things. But to put it simply, what happened was that Victor Billow contacted me about essentially the Alliance. We didn't realise it was still actually in existence at the time, and basically we were of the opinion that, basically it should be wound up and maybe it's money, so there was some monies and so on distributed. But however, several other people, younger people in their late 20s and 30s, had heard about the Alliance. They were unhappy and so on with the parties on offer, that is the Labour Party and the Greens. They consider themselves active socialists or social democrats, and they basically convinced us to resurrect the Alliance and give it one more go. And so essentially led by Tom Round, who's now the Alliance president, they had a meeting. They basically resurrected the alliance, and we stood up for a local body campaign on behalf of Tom. He didn't win, but he actually did quite well in terms of polling. Then a decision was made to essentially again resurrect the alliance and so on for basically a national campaign in the general election. And before I'd known it, Marvin, they had basically had an annual conference, elected people and so on for the annual conference, including Victor Billow, who people will remember and so on, who stood several times for the Dunedin North, and he's an old comrade of mine from the early days. And essentially, yes, it seems to be going, great guns. They've got about over 900 members, and yeah, they're resurrecting the branches, and we're actually getting policy together, which I'm helping to write. So, yes, it seems to be going quite well.
You've got a timeline of more than one election, really, because you'll be establishing things, I imagine, this election, and exploring what happens. And the next election is going to be quite serious for the alliance.
Yes, I'd imagine so. I mean, we decided, and, having been involved with this sort of stuff, though, not recently, but involved, as you're probably well aware, Marvin, over a significant period of my life, you sort of realize, that these things are sort of like, in one sense, slow burning. The alliance this time is really standing, as sort of a trial run to get ourselves back together and to re-establish ourselves. The real campaign, of course, will probably start in 2028 with the local bodies, when essentially the alliance is going to commit itself to running a full slate of candidates where we can. And from then, of course, we're going to be campaigning, of course, for the 2029 general election.
I can imagine there'll be a number of people who would like to support the alliance for a local body election. Of course, we don't know what kind of local bodies we'll have by then in our democratic society.
Well, I mean, I
that's
imagine,
a bit of sarcasm too, actually.
Yeah, I get it that. I mean, because of course we're all very well aware and so on of what the current government is doing in terms of local bodies, and it's abolition of regional councils, and it's forcing together of essentially local councils into huge, humongous bodies. I know here in Christchurch, of course, there's been a lot of angst and so on about it, and what it means for services and what it means for sort of local democracy and so on like that. And the speed at which it's being actually pursued, is extremely, it's in line with what the government is actually doing.
That reminds me of the 80s. I mean, do things quickly and nobody will have time to oppose you.
And that's quite right. I mean, if you recall the 1980s, of course, that was Roger Douglas's plan, essentially a blitzkrieg of policies that people couldn't really oppose or keep up with. And he used it to great effect.
It's interesting. They talk about conservative parties, but the right wing is not conservative at all.
No, not at all. And I think you're quite right, Marvin. One of the great successes I've always said, because occasionally to keep myself basically in tune with things, I do talks and lectures with the Canterbury Workers' Education Authority Association around politics, is that the most successful government National ever had was a Holyoake government, and essentially in the 60s, and it was based really as a conservative government. Holyoake was a conservative, and National won slightly because of the fact it didn't actually pursue radical agendas that rocked the boat. And the current government, has essentially is severely rocking the boat. In fact, it's actually punching holes into the boat to the extent that the boat is sinking, kind of like the Titanic, really, And so, we're in a situation now, I think that's really, very reminiscent of 1992.
One of the things that I've learned over the years is much easier to destroy institutions and policies than it is to make them or to repair them. I mean, that would be one of the major differences, I think, between the white ring as we know it now and conservative philosophy, as people used to talk about, is because it's more about destroying what we have now and then not worrying about what we're going to have in the future because the market will take care of it.
Yeah, well, I think that what I've been really quite astonished at in terms of the current government is essentially the degree to which ACT and basically New Zealand First being allowed to actually pursue their agendas. I can't think of any government, either National or Labour, that would allow their coalition partners to actually get away with so much. And I think it really speaks, I think, to the sort of, I think, the weakness of both the National Party and, of course, Chris Luxton as Prime Minister.
I also suspect that part of the problem with Nationals, they don't really have any real ideas about policy. And so ACT, New Zealand First, and particularly ACT can push their policies, and National doesn't have the policies to oppose it.
I agree. I do agree with you, Marvin. I think that, National is incredibly weak in that area, and New Zealand First and ACT have taken advantage of it. They've written a document that essentially ties National into supporting all their whacked-out theories and policies, and essentially just run with it. And because National is now in a situation, it can't really oppose them, because if it does, then what would happen is that the government would fall, and they don't want that. So I think they all sit around the cabinet rooms, I'm pretty convinced, all hating each other, but passing these outrageous policies because they can't not. So, yeah. I think they're probably in the worst of all possible worlds. It needs to be put out of this misery.
Now, many people will think of the Alliance Party, especially its name, as a retrogressive party. How should the Alliance deal with this issue?
Well, at the moment, I don't think we should do much in song about the issue at all, because we're in the middle of an election campaign. I think that these sorts of issues and so on are things that need to be dealt with and so on probably in the next year. If there's going to be a name change. And look, I'm not opposed to the name change. The Alliance, as you'll well recall too, came across originally because it was in fact an alliance of 5 parties. Now there is no alliance, but you could argue that there's an alliance of different groups, socialists and social democrats and so on like that. But, there is certainly been a perspective that, basically that, there needs to be something new, that there could be a new name and so on as well, and that basically, various names are being, sort of tossed around. But I think at this point, it's the time to have that discussion is probably next year. In one sense, I'm kind of reluctant, because, Marvin, you'll probably appreciate this too, that essentially sometimes new names don't solve problems, they actually can cause them. I'm thinking particularly of Social Credit, that renamed itself the Democrats and then essentially stunk without a trace.
Yeah, then people forgot who they were.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then, of course, I understand that after they left the alliance and, joined Jim Anderton's Progressive Coalition, they called themselves the Democrats for Social Credit, which just helped to confuse the issue even more. So, I'm not opposed to it, but I think it's one of those things that, essentially we need to have a discussion. Now is not the time to have that discussion, but certainly I think after the election.
What kind of policy does the Alliance have?
Well, the policy that we have, it's pertinent you mentioned that, because I've been busy, sort of updating the policy and stuff like that recently. I can definitely tell you it's a democratic socialist policy or left-wing social democracy. Essentially, it believes in state and public ownership, radical democratisation, managed trade, fully funded public services, all the good things and so on.
You mean you actually fund the health service so that they could meet?
Amazingly, yes. And we also believe in things like, for example, a progressive tax system, capital gains taxes, wealth taxes, and various other things, all designed to get the people who have not been paying tax, i.e. the richest people in this country, to actually pay their fair share of tax. Our tax system would actually lower taxes for most people and up it where it should be actually increased. So all those sort of good things and so on that we used to actually expect from governments, we've done that. It's be probably fair to say it's more in a European style of a socialist party and so on from Europe.
After hearing your policy, it sounds like it's a lot like the Green policy. What's going to be the relationship of the alliance with the Greens?
I think there's an overlap between the Alliance and the Greens. I think that I know that we're more left-wing in terms of our economic policy and our social policy, and also in the way and so on that we actually talk about, labour organisations and deal with them and what we want to do. Essentially, we're more left-wing there. There is overlap and so on in terms of some of the social policy and in terms of the environmental policy and ecological policies and so on too. In terms of our relationship, we do have some people and so on who come from the Greens, and there are some people in the Greens who essentially basically support us and so on like that. So I think that, there is the possibility there of cooperation perhaps in the future and so on like that, and I certainly wouldn't rule it out. And I think the Greens at the moment basically as the only probably left-wing party in Parliament essentially do a good job at essentially ensuring that a lot of left policies and so on are still there, but I wouldn't call the Greens a naturally left-wing party.
Now,
if you understand what I mean.
How do you see the sudden appearance of the Opportunities Party and them seeming to break the 5% threshold in less than 6 months?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Opportunities Party, as you well know, has been around for what, 2016 or 17 or something like that. Originally, it was led by the cat-hating economist Gareth Morgan, who set it up as sort of a radical alternative. I remember Gareth Morgan from the 1980s and 1990s. He never struck me as a left-winger then, and I certainly don't think that he's a left-winger now. And what I find probably the most disturbing, Marvin, is the fact that people now tend to define people as being left-wing or right-wing in comparison to the government. So you're left-wing and so on because National is so right-wing. But the fact is that Top is actually a right-wing party. And when you read their stuff, their policies, it becomes very apparent that, in fact, they're a right-wing party because people get fixated on the land tax and on the UBI, but they forget to actually read the other stuff and so on that's actually there in the policy. And when you do, you read about the public service, you read about their flat tax proposals, you read about all these other things. And then, of course, if you listen to what they actually say, because they're very happy, as they've said, to actually leap into bed with National. In fact, even though Chris Luxton has ruled it out, the leader of Top Q has basically said that she, quite willingly, basically want to talk with National and so on like that. And I think that people get confused, they're dissatisfied or unhappy with both National and Labour, and so they think that this is an easy choice. But quite frankly, Marvin, to be honest, I would compare Top as a modern version of Peter Dunn. And essentially, you might recall in 2002, Peter Dunn, of course, took his party from nowhere to achieving 9% on the basis of a worm, and essentially that was on TV, and the media not paying any attention and so on, and not doing any investigation of it. And it all ended disastrously and so on for Peter Dunn, and essentially I predict the same for Top.
do you have any predictions about the coming election?
Well, I mean, I think at the moment it's very close. My gut feeling is that Labor will outpoll National. My other gut feeling is that essentially Top will basically get over the threshold and probably get its 5%. I think that probably what will happen is that the government will go out, the current government will lose. But again, it's a bit like reading chicken entrails. But I don't think there's actually much love for the current government and so on out there. A lot of it, unfortunately, will basically depend on what Winston Peters does.
Well, where is he now in the polls?
Well,
they've gone down slightly.
Yeah, they have. I mean, again, as you know, Peters is a political Lazarus, but I think he's peaked too soon this time. And his old stalking grounds of, race and stuff like that haven't actually hit home like they have in the past. So he is giving it a damn good try, essentially accusing, people of, essentially, running race-based policies and so on like that. My gut feeling, though, is that essentially it won't work for him this time around. But like I said, I can see Top actually making a breakthrough, and I think I can also see Top basically being eaten alive in the next Parliament.
What do you? It seems to me that we're facing economic and environmental change no matter who we vote for. I don't mean that we'll get what we want, but I can't see the present system carrying on uninterrupted, that both things are changing internationally and the global economy is, particularly because of the war in Iran, but for other reasons, is on a knife edge. And the present government is, if not denying climate change, they're acting like climate change isn't there. They're not going to meet the Paris Agreement commitments. Even our own climate commission says they're not keeping up with what they promised, or we promised, because we had a cross-parliament commitment to mitigate climate change, and including agricultural. This doesn't seem to be happening, does it?
No, and I agree. I think it's tremendously disappointing. I seem to remember when I was a student at Otago in the early 90s, going to hear about I think it was the Paris Agreement or something like that. I think it must have been about 1991 or 1992. And at that point, essentially we were told, I think we had 35 years to actually turn things around. And of course, it's hard to believe, but, essentially we've wasted it. And when you look and so on at the politicians now, essentially they seem to basically, on the one hand, try to deny climate change, but on the other hand, they have to actually acknowledge it. But they're not willing to actually deal with it. And the reason they're not willing to deal with it is because all of them, of course, are in the pay of, basically the corporations who don't want to do so. So, essentially the oil, coal, all the fossilized industries. I am given hope, though, Marvin, with the fact that essentially one of the largest climate deniers, i.e. your President Donald Trump, essentially...
Not mine, thank you.
seems to basically, essentially have really sort of, falling into a hole and so on around this. I mean, it's quite obvious that, his policies are not working. It's quite obvious, too, that the United States is in great economic and environmental problems. What is happening in Europe and in Canada and so on with wildfires just breaking out in 38 to 40 degree temperatures is not normal. And there's been an acknowledgement now that, hey, things have, reached this point. And I think the reaction and so on to those people and to people like Trump and so on is growing, and you see that, of course, in sort of the rise and so on of people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the resurgence of Bernie Sanders, and in the rise and so on of the sort of left-wing groups, even in the United Kingdom and stuff like that. And I find that encouraging, because otherwise, we'd just be marching really onto a road to hell.
It's a really funny thing about the Iran war, because in some ways it's proven how unresilient the New Zealand economy, many neoliberal economies are, not prepared at all for any kind of emergency that affects oil and coal.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that, essentially that, even if there wasn't a climate change, even if you didn't accept that argument, and that basically they used to talk about, and again, you'll probably remember this 20 years ago, peak oil. And that is, essentially that there's only so much oil in the earth and we've used most of it. And so even if you didn't believe in climate change, at some point, basically we're going to reach a situation very soon where there won't be enough oil. So this in itself, would indicate to me a good reason why we should be looking at alternative technologies and, alternative fuels and different ways of doing things. But obviously not to some people because of the fact that, they won't make billions of dollars out of it. And, they are prepared to basically keep on basically promoting this stuff and pursuing it even while the world burns.
I mean, it's obvious that the conventional energy companies, particularly coal and oil, are willing to sacrifice the next future generations in total, because we're not looking at, if climate change hits certain tipping points, you're looking at not 20 years or 50 years, you're looking at, maybe 1,000 years of real difficulty.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I agree. And I think we've reached the point now that essentially, it's impossible to ignore. What is happening is impossible to ignore and so on. And, they're trying their best to actually do that. But I think now that the vast majority of people in the West basically accept that climate change is happening and that something needs to be done. But that doesn't stop them, trying desperately to jam on the brakes. I mean, if you had the misfortune, to live in the developing nations and so on, in Africa or in the Pacific or so on like that, you're basically screwed.
The upheaval.
Or depressing stuff, Marvin.
The upheaval that's going to happen in the Pacific Islands is going to massively affect New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about the need for massive immigration, not because people want to leave their home, but their home is leaving them. The home's sinking under the rise of sea level.
Yeah, exactly. And as you've quickly pointed out, that's already happening. And, but I mean, like I said, I am encouraged by the fact, that there's an awareness now, and there has been a significant pushback against, these villains, who essentially are doing this. But I think that there's going to be a lot of pain before, basically, things get better, so to speak. But I mean, I think though that neoliberalism, what we termed the new right back in the day, Marvin, has definitely finally, I think, being revealed as essentially the fraud that it always was, that, essentially it's created this situation, it's worsened the situation, it hasn't delivered great profits that it promised, it hasn't, delivered social stability, it hasn't delivered economic or even, basically democratic stability. Because when you look at the democracies across the world, they're breaking down. And one of the reasons, I think the principal reasons they're breaking down is because people no longer have faith in the system and faith in those MPs and so on that continuously promote this claptrap.
It seems to me that one of the important things to recognize is that the neoliberal governments basically don't have any concept of the common good. And the common good includes not only every citizen in that country, but it also includes the environment and the world that people are living in. It's not like you can replace the world. I mean, some people talk about going to Mars, just like some people from Silicon Valley talk about living for 1,000 years with your head in a computer. But somehow that doesn't sound convincing to me.
No, well, I mean, Mars is, as you, is a completely uninhabitable planet.
I understand the soil is poisonous.
Yes, that's right. And if you could spend billions and billions and billions of dollars, to basically terraform Mars, or probably trillions, then we should spend a far lesser amount of money actually making Earth a better place to actually live. And I'm mindful of, the groundswell, which is basically one of those sort of astroturf agencies set up by Atlas and the Business Roundtable and so on like that, or was it the New Zealand Initiative, as they call themselves now, to lobby for farmers. And essentially they were busy arguing about the need to lead the Paris Accords and stuff like that. But the response to them, as someone said, is you can't farm on a dead planet. And, that's a reason why, in fact, even for their own, basically their own future, they should be looking at these sorts of things. Instead of basically trying to say, well, if we do nothing, things will get better. It won't get better. It's actually gotten worse.
Well, I guess that's one of the things that worries you, because you would think that people would be up in arms, frankly, by this point. And I wonder what's going to happen to Europe after when the fire season's over, how Europeans are going to react, because it'll be quite clear to almost all Europeans that these fires have been caused by climate change.
Yeah, and again, I agree. And again, there are hopeful things and so on happening there. But there are also, at the same time, of course, I'd say disruptors to the system. And I'm thinking, basically parties like Reform and so on like that, who consistently, essentially deny climate change and, more importantly, blame people like immigrants and so on like that for everything that's happening. But again, I think they're being revealed for the charlatans they actually are. One would hope, too, that the left, and I think that this is the important thing, too, the left, I think, needs to rediscover, its first principles. What was the left about? Why were we actually involved in Parliament? Essentially, about, essentially preserving the planet, but also, ensuring that people had a say in the running of society, that people could participate in running of society. And I think that we need to rediscover that, too, and be part of, I think, the general pushback.
It seems to me that environmental change and the common good really have to go together, because I can't imagine you could actually accept that if you get people to accept change, they have to be part of the change.
No, I agree. And I mean, all of this, Marvin, of course, you'll remember a wonderful person, again, I'm being sarcastic, called Mrs. Thatcher. And, Margaret Thatcher's famous quote about there is no such thing as society. And essentially all of this, of course, is really modelled on that sort of belief. But the fact is that there is such a thing as society. There is such a thing, as you've correctly pointed out, that we're all connected and interrelated together. And, what do we actually do to resolve the situation, to basically bring things back, to allow people to actually basically be able to participate and create a better community, a better society for everyone? And unfortunately, of course, that isn't through the market.
One of the things you have to hope is that the midterm elections in America actually happen, and the Democratic Party, particularly the left wing of the Democratic Party, does well. Because one of the problems we have is the willingness of the Trump administration to meddle in other countries' politics, other countries' democracies. Not only threaten places like Greenland and even Canada, but also putting money into right-wing policies.
Completely. And
it's pretty clear that Colombia, for instance, they put in quite a bit of money to get rid of a left-wing party and president who was actually making peace there for the first time, as well as environmental change.
Well, of course, as you know, Marvin, Donald Trump believes in the Dunroe document, which is an updated version of the Monroe document in South America. And even here in New Zealand, the American ambassador or the new ambassador here has made it quite clear that essentially his main purpose is to actually pursue, the insane, international relations for him of his boss, of Donald Trump. And one of the things he wants to do is renegotiate, essentially the anti-nuclear, basically policy and so on that we've actually had since the 1980s. And his stated intent of saying if he could invent a time machine, he'd go back and ensure that we never passed it. So, I mean, you're quite correct. Essentially, the United States has shown a great tendency in recent years, far more so than any other previous years, of basically throwing its weight around quite openly. But in doing so, I think it's also presented itself as actually far weaker than basically it's been for whatever.
Well,
it can't win a war in Iran. It's basically, essentially had egg over its face and so on of a number of issues, all of which have been caused by Donald Trump.
Well, that's quite interesting because any fool could have told Donald Trump that invading Iran would close off the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, well, one would think that, essentially, and this is why, previous presidents, even though they might have thought it, didn't actually do anything. Not even George W., who up to this point, have been regarded as one of the more intellectually challenged presidents. And, but hey, you've now got a complete idiot in charge of the White House, and this is what is happening.
Well, one of the interesting things about Trump is that he managed to, like other strong leaders, gotten rid of all the advice that the people who might have advised him.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And, I think that, as you've said, essentially at the moment, people are really counting down, I think, to November. And it will come, of course, at the extent to one, essentially what happens there, whether or not what Trump uses to try and block it, because I think he's very well aware that, he's going to lose. And there could be a Democratic, not a tidal, not a surge, but actually a tsunami that could sweep away the Republicans in both the House and the Senate.
Well, actually, they need a tsunami because the electoral boundaries have been so unfairly, undemocratically amended by Republican governors and legislatures.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
The difficulty for voting, calling for IDs that many people can't. I mean, if you don't have a passport or a driver's license, why, it's very hard to prove who you are in America.
Well, I mean, he hasn't been able to actually essentially put forward the Save America Act and so on, which is what he wanted to do. And so, I mean, that has actually been good, essentially. So he hasn't been able to actually do that. And again, essentially, but it will come down to, I think, what happens in November. I think it will also come down to essentially what happens within the Democratic Party and so on too, because there is pushback and so on by the moderate Democrats against what they see as progressive ones. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that essentially that there will be enough progressive Democrats will be elected to actually start to actually have significant change.
What are your hopes for the future of New Zealand?
Well, I mean, I live in hope, Marvin. I've become a cautiously optimistic person. And, I hope that essentially that if there is change in song elsewhere, that we will basically ride that wave. I think that the new right has failed here in New Zealand, and I think now it's basically openly, seen as having failed. The problem that I have, of course, is the fact that there are still, it's entrenched here. It's very much entrenched, and there is a large proportion of people who essentially, for whatever reason, still sort of believe parts and so on of it.
Well, the Treasury still has a neoliberal attitude about taxation and also about borrowing money. I mean, it's much cheaper for a government to borrow money for their infrastructure.
It's just not Treasury. It's, the entire public system has been basically captured by the neoliberals. So, essentially MIMB and MPI and so on, they're now essentially all running a similar, ideological line. And so, we need to be aware of that. We need to actually, I think, again, look at what sort of society we actually want. And quite frankly, I think it is time that people need to wake up and say, well, this isn't working. And essentially we need to actually endorse and, basically go with people and so on who have an alternative and so on to that.
Do you think we should build institutions that will give us a variety of suggestions, a variety of economics? I mean, one reason the Labour Party in the 80s got rid of the Department of Public Works is the Department of Public Works actually gave them counter advice to what Treasury gave them. Yes,
the old Ministry of Works Planning Department. It was the first one up against the wall. No, I agree. I think that there needs to be essentially more public debate and so on, and discussion, and more, I think, opposition to these insane policies trotted out by Treasury and others and so on within the public area. I know that Harold Wilson, when he was Prime Minister in the UK, for example, in the 60s, actually set up an alternative economic advisor to their Treasury, to their exchequer of the exchange, to actually bring in, alternative points of view. And I don't know if we're at that point, but certainly, I would not be opposed to investigating something like that.
Are you following what's happening in the Labour Party in England? How do you see it?
Well, again, that's an interesting one too. Yes, I am. Basically, the Labour Party in the UK has a lot of issues and so on. I think that it won't just be solved by, essentially just replacing the leader. There has to be substantive change within the Labour Party. And again, like the Labour Party here, I think it's a party that's basically very unsure about what it actually now believes in. And it won't be enough, as I said, of just changing the horses in front. I think that they'll need to actually look at basically, what the Labour Party actually believes in the UK and how it should be implemented. One of the things they could do, of course, is essentially adopt an MMP type system. Because, Britain is one of those countries, one of the few remaining that still have first past the post. And I think that, essentially by adopting such a system, they'll allow, sort of alternatives to actually grow. Certainly, they'd have the Greens in Parliament and much greater force and so on if they had an MMP type system. The Scottish Nationalist Party, the Welsh Party and so on like that.
Well, so you now face the future with a certain amount of hope. And that's quite good, really, because if you believe there's hope, then you can believe that change is possible and have the energy to work for it. Thanks a lot for coming on board.
No, thank you, Marvin.
And you find your hope in the people, don't you? And the fact that the obvious, what we're experiencing tells us we need to change.
Yeah. Yes, so thank you for having me back on the show, Marvin. Like I said, it's been a long time between talks, and hopefully, we can have another talk at some point soon. I better get back to my everyday job.
Okay, thanks a lot, Quentin.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.